Hi, it's Jessie. Today I'm drinking Tale 2 tea from the Witchwood Tea House, and I will be reviewing the Poppy War series by RF Kuang. So if you haven't heard of it by now, because it's been popular for a while, the third book just came out this last year and everybody was super into it. The Poppy War is a trilogy of books. It's a fantasy series based on the Sino-Japanese War. I believe it's the second Sino-Japanese War, but I'm not 100% certain on that. And it follows the character of Rin, who is a young war orphan who just kind of wants to change her fates, and the best way to do that is to get in and then do well at the war college for her area. And then war breaks out and everything kind of goes... It's crazy. And it's really good. It's really dark. If you haven't heard before, it's very, very, very brutal. The Sino-Japanese War was full of awful war atrocities where terrible, terrible things were done to people. And RF Kuang, Rebecca Kuang, does not shy away from that in this book. In this series, so just something to be aware of going in. It seems kind of almost light at the beginning. I mean, there's a lot of references to like drug use, opium, early on, but like the first like third, even maybe 2/3 of the first book kind of feels like, okay, this is kind of a typical war fantasy. Yeah, there's war happening. Yeah, people are dying, but it's fine. It is not. So just be aware of that. I would definitely recommend looking up trigger warnings before you go into this. Just some off the top of my head real quick. Drug use, addiction, drug abuse, medical content and trauma, forced institutionalization, rape, sexual assault, murder, blood, gore. It's brutal. And mentally, emotionally, it's brutal. So just something to be aware of. If you're interested. I might be talking about some of those themes in this review, so if that's uncomfortable for you, I understand. No pressure. But yeah, let's go ahead and get into that with my sticky note full of categories. So the first and foremost, what I judge a book on, characters. And this gets a 10 out of 10 for characters. There are a core cast of characters in this series, and it's Rin's classmate. There's two different groups. There's Rin's classmates, and then there's the people she ends up working with when she gets recruited. So you have Rin herself, who is not likable. I think I would be surprised to find out that if anybody comes out of the first, definitely the second book of this, being like, man, I want to be best friends with Rin, I'd be very surprised. But she's well written, and she's unlikable in a very realistic way. And that kind of defines basically all of the characters. There's maybe two characters that I unapologetically love and think are delightful and wonderful, and basically everybody else is terrible and I hate them, but they're well written and I love them. So you have Rin, you have her classmates are Kitai, Nuja, and Venka are her three classmates that you learn a little bit. Alton kind of does both. He's a classmate, but then she works with him. And then there's the group that she works with, whose names I can't remember right now because I'm bad at names. And every single one of the characters are really fleshed out. They're deep. Kitai is probably one of my favorites because he really straddles this line that I wish I could explain better without getting into spoilers, but he really represents this like duality of wanting to do the best but still remaining practical that I really relate to, where it's like hopeful yet pragmatic. And they all have that kind of depth to them where they do things that don't necessarily make sense because people do things that don't make sense, but you can see how they rationalized it, and it's really, really, the characters are fantastic. Moving on to plot, this gets a little iffier for me. I gave it an 8 out of 10. Now, the overall story is great. Don't get me wrong. The first book, though, is very disjointed. It's almost like 3 separate books jammed into one, where there's like these breaks where it's like, this just completely changed what the novel is about. I think there's a lot of repetition where the plot kind of hits the same nail over and over and over again. So that's kind of where the issue with the plots came in for me, but I think it's really an interesting story and it's fascinating and there's twists and turns and you see a lot coming, but there's always things you don't see coming. So it's really overall a good story. Moving on to setting, again a 10 out of 10. This is really interesting because it's kind of like in fantasy we're used to settings that are like Europe but add dragons. And this is kind of like that. It's Asia but add magic. But not entirely one-to-one, but I also think in the way Kuang uses the setting, it's really brilliant because she uses it for a shortcut for a lot of things. Is this a spoiler? No, I don't think so. So like one of the nations is obviously like England, right? Because England was involved in this whole thing. And there's a point where it talks about how they seem to be taking a hands-off approach or something like that. And knowing the time period that the Sino-Japanese War was, you're like, oh yes, this is everything that's going on with this nation right now. Because I know actual real life history without that having to be spelled out for us. And I think it's a really interesting thing she does, that she really creates this deeper world by using those shortcuts. And I think it's really well done. But then she also goes through and she makes it her own and she adds unique flair to it, and it's really fascinating. My general appeal for this, so this is my like, just what I thought of it, was a 9 out of 10. I think it's great. I had some issues with it, but I love it. Yeah, so anyway, rating style 8 out of 10. I think the rating style here is, it does what it needs to do. It's good. Like 8 is a great rating out of 10. It's not anything particularly special. There aren't any lines or moments that like stand out to me as like, wow, that was fantastic. I want to tattoo that on my arm. But it's also brutal. Like there's a way she like describes things where it's like simplistic yet visceral. And I think she does a really good job of that, so. For originality, I gave it a 10 out of 10. This is kind of a weird area where it's like, how original can you be when you're inspired by history? But I think she, one, because she's picking a period of history that like is unique to the fantasy genre. Like you get a million War of the Roses, but how many Sino-Japanese War fantasy stories have you gotten? So I think there's that, but I also think she really makes it her own. Like it doesn't sit there as just, here's a retelling of the Sino-Japanese War, but there's magic this time. Like she changes things. She looks at the facts of like, how would this impact this huge historical event? So I think she really takes these historical moments, takes these real life places and makes them her own. And that's why I think her originality is up there. And then finally the ending. Again, you can skip to the end of this video if you don't want any possible spoilers for the ending. I'm not going to talk about it in detail, so you don't have to worry about it, but I understand some people don't want any expectations. With that said, I gave the ending a 10 out of 10. I had my doubts, okay? So of all of the books in this series, The Burning God was a struggle for me. So I was reading it with a friend and we went straight from one book to the other, and we got to The Burning God and slowed down a lot because a lot of it was very repetitive. It felt like it was going over a lot of the things the second book had already done. And then we got to the end. And I don't know how she made it work, because like by the end of this, you don't know who to root for anymore. So you're like, I don't know who I want to win. I don't know how I want this to go. Like these people are clearly terrible, but so are these people. And somehow she resolves that in a way that you're like, yeah, that fits, you know, that tracks, that was right. And like, I won't say she redeems people. I won't for a second say that, because I don't think that was the intent. I think it was a moment of maybe absolution would be the better word for it. And it's just brilliantly done. And I just was impressed because I really didn't see how it was gonna come around at the end and work out, and it really did. So the ending is fantastic. So circling back around, overall this book got a 9.15, 9 15/100ths out of 10 for an overall rating for the series. It's really good. I think I would recommend it for anyone. Even if you're not really a fantasy fan, like if you're like, I'm trying to get my partner to read it because he's a history buff, and I'm like, hey, wait, maybe you might want to try this. And there's some things there I want to like learn more about the actual history, but I am afraid to, because of the way this affected me when it was fake. So I'm a little afraid of delving into that. So if anybody has a recommendation of like baby's first Sino-Japanese war textbook, maybe I could check that out, but like I don't know when or if I will be in the mental space to be able to process that. But I think it's a great fantasy. Like, it has the fantasy elements. There's this magic system where you ingest opium and talk to gods. Like, it's there. You don't have to ingest the opium. The opium is optional. But I think the like underlying story of the horrors of war, of the way war changes people, of the way you're willing to sacrifice your moral code because something else you deem more important or because of trauma, I think really can speak to anyone. So I really recommend this. I really recommend this series if, and only if, you were comfortable reading about all of it. All right. Thanks for listening. If you liked it, go ahead, hit the like button down below. If you haven't subscribed yet, I do occasionally do book reviews. I do a lot more blogging lately, interestingly. Or my brother Ben and I talk Wheel of Time stuff. And yeah, that's everything. Let me know below if you've read that Poppy War, what you think. If you're interested in reading the Poppy War, if you have recommendations of how I can educate myself about the history behind the Poppy War, because I'm scared. And that's it for me. Bye.